Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The courtroom was never supposed to be a stage, yet on that morning in Elmsworth Civil Division Hall, it held the stillness of a place about to witness a sacred disruption. From the judge's clerk flipping through thick legal folders to the echo of polished shoes against the marble floor, everything carried a strange weight, like a kettle left too long on a fire, ready to scream. Henry sat beside Olivia, his mistress turned fiancée, his fingers twitching slightly over the folded document that bore the title Mutual Dissolution Agreement. The air smelt of ironed suits and spent perfumes, but beneath that, a tension thick enough to slice with a knife lingered. Olivia adjusted her pearl necklace for the fourth time, her smile thinner than tissue paper, trying hard to wear confidence the way one wears a borrowed dress, careful not to tear it. Then it happened. A long, sleek black limousine eased into the parking space outside the courthouse, its presence louder than any siren. The vehicle didn't arrive. It glided, like royalty returning from exile. People near the window stood on toes like school children peeking at a parade. Henry didn't stand. He didn't blink. He just stared, heart knocking against his ribs like a man trying to escape his own chest. From the car stepped a woman wrapped in quiet thunder. Clara. She wore a cream satin dress that hugged her figure like it still remembered the body it was made for. Her heels tapped the pavement slowly, deliberately, as though every step was an unspoken sentence in a speech only the brave would dare deliver. Olivia leaned toward Henry and whispered, "Who is that?" But the words came out like dust from a cupboard that hadn't been opened in years. Henry's throat dried up like spilled wine in harmattan heat. "That's my wife," he muttered. And just like that, the silence inside the courthouse cracked like thin glass. 4 months earlier, Clara would have laughed if someone told her she'd one day arrive at her own divorce in a limousine. She would have shaken her head and dismissed it as soap opera fantasy. But life, as she had learned, doesn't knock before entering. It crashes through your door, drags you by the hair, and teaches you lessons in a language Pain invented. The first shift came quietly, like a whisper behind a closed door. Henry started coming home late. First it was once or twice a week, then it became routine. He stopped noticing when she changed her hair, when she bought new curtains, or when she started sleeping on just one side of the bed. Even their silence began to feel choreographed, as if rehearsed over and over until it no longer needed words. Clara didn't scream. She didn't fight. She observed. Because when a man begins to drift, shouting only pushes him further out to sea. She kept cooking his meals, setting the table, and folding his clothes with the care of a woman who had once loved with both eyes closed. But inside her, something was stirring. One rainy evening, she followed his car, heart pounding like a village drum at a naming ceremony. She saw them, Henry and the woman, at a rooftop lounge, 2 glasses of wine deep into laughter that once belonged to her. Clara didn't cry. She stood in the shadows, rain soaking through her scarf, and stared like a ghost watching the living. She walked home, her heels slapping against the wet sidewalk like thunderclaps of betrayal. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake tracing the ceiling with her eyes, memorizing every crack as if searching for signs that her world wouldn't collapse. That was the night Clara began to change, not with rage, but with resolve. She didn't confront him, not immediately. There was no shouting match, no slaps, no breaking of plates. Clara understood something that Olivia hadn't yet learned. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one that says nothing. So she woke up early, applied her lipstick, and took a different road. She met with an old friend who ran her father's law firm and asked him for quiet advice. She began to move her funds, reinvest old savings, and sell unused shares her late mother had left behind. Not once did she accuse Henry. She still packed his lunch, still reminded him about his dentist appointments, still smiled when their neighbors waved. But beneath that smile lived a lioness waiting in stillness. She started writing in a journal again, pouring out her grief not with ink, but with fire. Her tears no longer fell freely. They gathered behind her eyes like storms that refused to rain. And every time Henry walked past her in silence, she noted how unfamiliar his silhouette had become, how his shoulders no longer told stories of the man she married. By the third month, Clara had seen enough. Not of Henry and Olivia, but of herself, of the version of her that allowed herself to shrink for a man who couldn't even hold her gaze. She began sleeping in a separate room, explaining it away with excuses about the heater and back pain. Henry didn't ask questions. He was too far gone in his new fantasy to realize his real life was rearranging its exit quietly. Olivia was the kind of woman who smiled with all her teeth and none of her thoughts. She giggled at everything Henry said, clutched his arm like a handbag she didn't want stolen, and believed, perhaps too quickly, that she'd won. To her, Clara was the old chapter, yellowed at the corners, and best forgotten. What she didn't realize was that Clara was the kind of page you return to when newer ones couldn't carry the weight of the story. Olivia pushed for Henry to speed up the divorce, insisting they deserved to live freely, to post each other on social media, to travel to Morocco without secrecy. Henry, flattered by youth and sweet perfume, nodded and agreed, too drunk on attention to realize that what sparkles in the sun can still burn you at night. Olivia decorated his apartment with scented candles and silk throws, all the while watching Clara from a distance like a hawk circling what it hoped was wounded prey. But Clara was no prey. She was a phoenix rubbing her feathers against the embers of betrayal, waiting for the right moment to rise. Olivia once visited the office to surprise Henry, only to see him deep in thought staring at a framed photo of him and Clara at the beach, their smiles loud with history. She said nothing then, but something in her paused. And on the day before the hearing, when Henry received a gift box on his desk containing the cufflinks Clara gave him on their 5th anniversary, polished, wrapped in navy blue silk, he sat back, held the metal like memory, and didn't speak for 5 whole minutes. Because nostalgia, like perfume, doesn't announce itself. It arrives, lingers, and chokes softly. Olivia often mistook attention for affection. When Henry brought her roses, she posted them with captions laced in poetry she didn't write, letting the internet crown her queen of a love she hadn't earned. In the beginning, it was thrilling. The secrecy, the late-night drives, the hush-hush rendezvous behind drawn blinds. But excitement, like perfume, fades when worn too long. Olivia had imagined Clara to be loud, bitter, and broken. She envisioned her as the type to scream in lobbies and claw at her husband's collar, begging to be loved. But the silence Clara wore unnerved her. The first time she saw Clara, it was from the other side of a tinted car window. They had stopped at a red light, and Clara had crossed the road with a grocery bag in hand, shoulders high and head unbowed. Olivia noticed how the street breeze flirted with her scarf and how her eyes scanned nothing and everything. For a moment, Olivia wondered what Clara knew, what she'd seen, what she'd chosen not to say. That night, when Olivia laughed a little louder at Henry's jokes and traced circles on his palm with her thumb, it wasn't love, it was fear dressed in flirtation. Something in her had started to question what kind of woman watches her marriage decay like a crumbling wall and simply sweeps the dust without a word. Henry reassured her that Clara was done, that she had accepted her fate, that the silence was surrender. But Olivia knew better. She had a mother who once smiled the same way, all while packing the bags of a cheating father she later left in the rain. She'd seen it before, women who stitched their pride into silence and waited for the final thread to snap. That kind of woman doesn't scream. She strikes. In Henry's world, everything had compartments, files for taxes, drawers for socks, memories for different women. He was the kind of man who could compartmentalize heartbreak like a spreadsheet, believing emotions could be postponed, and postponed again until they simply expired. With Olivia, things felt like a new coat, shiny, flattering, but not broken in. He enjoyed her laughter, her endless admiration, the way she hung onto every word like a child at bedtime. But over time, even sugar tires the tongue. Their conversations became echoes of compliments, their moments curated like a photo album for strangers. What used to feel like freedom began to feel like noise. And sometimes, late at night, when Olivia fell asleep first, Henry would find himself staring at the ceiling, tracing regrets with his eyes, wondering if happiness was simply too quiet for him to recognize. Clara's silence haunted him, not because it was cold, but because it was composed. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding too much and speaking too little. He tried not to think about the last time she touched his face. It was subtle, brief, a thumb grazing his jaw as she handed him his car keys. No words, just touch. And yet that touch stayed with him more than Olivia's declarations of love shouted across the bed. He told himself he'd moved on, that new chapters require closed doors. But deep inside, he feared he'd walked through a door that locked itself behind him while the real keys still hung quietly in Clara's pocket. The limbo between guilt and pride began to stretch, and he stood in it like a man watching the tide rise without knowing how to swim. Clara, meanwhile, had begun planting her new life not in loud declarations, but in quiet, deliberate acts. She visited art galleries on Sunday afternoons and bought herself flowers on Thursdays. She changed the curtains, painted the guest room a soft emerald, and removed all photos of her and Henry from the hallway, not in bitterness, but in readiness. When she walked past the photo frame where their wedding portrait once hung, she didn't flinch. Instead, she placed a painting there, abstract, complex, mostly blue. Her therapist, whom she had begun seeing once a week, described her as grace wrapped in grief. Clara didn't deny it. She was grieving the years she invested, the dreams she watered alone, the loyalty that aged without recognition. But grief, she knew, was not a prison. It was a tunnel. And while most people turned back midway out of fear, she had chosen to walk through, barefoot if necessary. On one of those evenings, after watering her garden and lighting a candle beside her bed, she received a call from Henry's younger sister, Ella. Clara answered, her voice even. Ella apologized for Henry's behavior, for the family's silence, for everything. Clara responded with kindness, but didn't stay long on the call. After hanging up, she exhaled deeply, not from pain, but from freedom. Each day, her spirit unclenched a little more. She began to laugh at jokes on the radio, to dream new dreams, and to plan a trip to Cape Town, a place she once mentioned to Henry during their honeymoon, but he had brushed off as too far, too soon. That trip was now marked on her calendar. She'd go alone. A week before the court date, Clara received the official letter confirming the time, date, and courtroom number. She held the envelope for a long minute before opening it, as though it might explode. But it didn't. Paper never does. What explodes is what we remember while holding it. She sat at her dressing table, reread the document, and then picked up her phone to call the limo service. She didn't want the dramatic entrance. What she wanted was poise. A statement without words, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she had long finished writing. As she spoke with the driver to finalize details, she glanced at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was not the Clara who once cried in the kitchen over uneaten dinner. She wasn't the woman who checked Henry's location at 2 a.m. or sniffed shirts for perfume. This Clara blinked slowly, deliberately, with the peace of someone who had nothing to prove. When she rose from the stool and walked into her closet, she reached for the cream satin dress that still had the tag on. Henry bought it 3 years ago, urging her to wear it to a gala she was too overwhelmed to attend. She kept it then, just in case the perfect day came. Now she knew. The day didn't have to be perfect. She just had to be prepared. She pressed the dress that night herself, laid it over the guest bed like a guest she'd waited years to meet, and smiled. A small, quiet smile, the kind you wear when the war is over, and though the battlefield is empty, the lesson remains. On the morning of the divorce hearing, the sun rose like it had something to prove. The sky over Elmsworth was dressed in soft orange hues, casting a golden film over the courthouse building that made it look more like a sacred cathedral than a place where hearts were severed legally. Clara woke early, her breath steady as she poured hot water into a basin, gently rinsing her face with lavender soap and soft cloth. She moved about her room with the precision of someone laying bricks for a new foundation, quiet, firm, and focused. She wore the satin dress not because it made a statement, but because it told a story, one of dignity folded in fabric, grace stitched into every seam. When the limousine arrived at her gate, she didn't rush. She stepped out like rain in a dry village, soft, surprising, and unforgettable. As she sat inside, the driver opened the door with quiet reverence, as though he sensed he wasn't just chauffeuring a client, but escorting a woman back into her power. Inside the car, the air smelled of leather and resolve. Clara stared out the tinted window as familiar roads slipped behind her. She didn't think of Henry. She didn't wonder what he was doing or how he would react. Instead, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for reconciliation, but for revelation. Let the truth be seen, not just said. Let eyes be opened without words. And with that, she leaned back, lips parted slightly, as if tasting freedom for the first time. Henry, on the other hand, was a walking contradiction that morning. He shaved twice, couldn't choose a tie, and changed his suit 3 times, each one failing to hide the internal tremors ricocheting through his chest. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed with a coffee mug untouched in her hand, watching him like someone observing a ticking clock that no longer told the right time. She had expected calmness, even celebration, but Henry was distant, detached in a way she hadn't seen before. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that doesn't scream but hums in the corners of silence like a wasp behind a curtain. Olivia tried to draw him back with compliments, soft touches, even flirtation, but his responses were mechanical, smiles that didn't reach his eyes, kisses that landed like obligations. On the way to the courthouse, she asked him if he was sure about everything. He answered too quickly, like someone trying to convince himself. "Of course," he said, eyes forward, fingers tapping against his thigh like a metronome. "It's time." Olivia nodded, but her stomach churned like laundry in a restless machine. Something didn't sit right. And when they arrived at the courthouse, stepped out of the vehicle, and climbed the stairs side by side, she felt the distance between them widening, like a crack in a frozen lake quietly spreading with each step. She held his arm, but it felt colder than usual. The doors of the courtroom opened, and suddenly Olivia was struck with the terrifying thought that she may have won the race, only to realize the trophy was hollow. Inside the courtroom, time moved like wet cement. Every clock tick echoed louder than it should, and even the judge seemed to fidget with his files longer than necessary. The legal clerk shuffled pages, occasionally glancing up as though waiting for a cue. Henry and Olivia sat side by side, but their bodies betrayed them. His leaned slightly forward, hers leaned away. And then the whisper began, first like a rumor tickling the back of the room, then a wave crashing forward. The bailiff glanced at the courtroom doors, then leaned into the judge's ear. The judge arched an eyebrow, muttered something inaudible, and returned to scanning the front page of the case file. Outside, tires rolled softly over stone as the limousine curved into view. Its engine purred like a beast content with its own power, unbothered by what waited on the other side of the door. Olivia turned to see what the whisper was about, but all she caught was movement, people rising, windows adjusting, murmurs rising like smoke from dry firewood. The doors creaked open. Clara walked in, and she didn't just enter, she arrived. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Henry didn't turn immediately, but when he did, he looked like a man who'd forgotten how to breathe. Clara's heels clacked against the marble floor with the rhythm of someone unbothered by storms. She wore serenity like perfume, and it lingered long after she passed. Olivia's grip on Henry's arm loosened. She didn't need an explanation. She could see it. The past had just walked in, not to plead, but to witness. And Clara? She sat, crossed her legs, smiled at the judge, and waited. The courtroom buzzed for several minutes before order returned. The judge apologized for the delay, citing some missing case documents that needed retrieval. It was a small clerical error, but it forced the three of them, Clara, Henry, and Olivia, to sit in the same waiting area just outside the courtroom chamber. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. There, in the hallway painted in beige and silence, the true trial began. Olivia fidgeted. She glanced at Clara's dress, her calm face, her unhurried breath. Clara didn't look at her once, not out of arrogance, but because looking wasn't necessary. Her presence was louder than speech. Henry sat between them, but the space around him felt tighter than ever. He was boxed in by consequence, like a man trying to fold an umbrella in a hurricane. Clara took a sip from a water bottle she'd brought in her purse, her fingers unshaking. Olivia finally spoke, her voice a low murmur. "You look good." Clara turned, not with a smile, but with the kind of look that says, "I see everything, but I choose peace." "Thank you," she replied, tone even. "I feel free." That word, free. It sliced through the hallway like wind through dry grass. Henry's head dropped slightly, his thumb rubbing his ring finger, an old habit from when he used to wear something there. Olivia crossed her arms, chewing her lower lip like it might offer answers. Clara uncrossed her legs, stood, and adjusted her dress. "Excuse me," she said softly, walking toward the restrooms. But really, she was walking away from everything that had tried to break her. In that brief pause, both Henry and Olivia felt it, not rage, not regret, but the undeniable weight of being left behind, not because they weren't chosen, but because they were no longer needed. And sometimes, that's heavier than any goodbye. The waiting room outside the courtroom had become more than just a hallway. It had turned into a quiet battlefield where glances were sharper than daggers and silence bled tension into every corner. Henry sat like a man who had been left out in the rain without an umbrella, soggy with regret, confused about how he'd gotten there, and unsure if he deserved to be let back inside. He fiddled with his wristwatch, though he hadn't worn one in months. Beside him, Olivia crossed and uncrossed her legs, pretending not to feel the shift in atmosphere since Clara walked in. But the truth was that everything had shifted, the energy, the confidence, even the air. Clara's silence was no longer just unsettling. It had begun to feel instructional. She didn't try to make a scene, didn't so much as glance at the woman who had laid claim to her husband's affections. That kind of composure made Olivia itch, the kind of itch that comes from guilt buried too close to the skin. Henry tried to lean back, to breathe deeply, but the walls were closing in, and the scent of Clara's perfume was now too familiar to ignore. It wasn't jealousy that gnawed at Olivia. It was the realization that even in presence, she felt like a placeholder. Her relationship, once shiny and full of promise, now seemed like a house built too fast with bricks that hadn't dried. And every second Clara sat there, composed and confident, Olivia felt a piece of that house begin to crack. She could no longer hear the victory song she once hummed in her head. All she could hear now was the steady ticking of Clara's quiet strength, reminding her that some women win by simply walking in. Clara returned from the restroom with her chin lifted, not as a statement, but as a habit formed from months of lifting herself up in private. She didn't strut, she didn't sway. She simply moved like someone whose balance no longer depended on the presence of others. When she sat down, she gently pulled out a small notebook from her handbag and began to write. Olivia watched her from the side of her eye, trying not to appear obvious, but curiosity was already dancing in her chest. What could she possibly be writing now? Olivia wondered. Poetry? A list of losses? A goodbye note? But Clara's pen didn't pause, and her face didn't betray anything. That mystery made Olivia shift in her seat again. Henry, growing more aware of the discomfort tightening around his neck like a collar, finally whispered, "You don't have to sit through this if it makes you uncomfortable." But his voice was unsure, lacking the firmness that once defined him. Olivia looked at him and gave a weak smile, one that cracked before it even settled on her lips. "You think I'm uncomfortable now?" she said, just loud enough for him to hear. "Wait until the papers are signed and it becomes permanent." Henry didn't respond. There was no clever comeback, no smooth line to slide in between her sarcasm and sincerity. Instead, he looked down at his shoes, the same pair Clara had bought him 2 Christmases ago. In that moment, even leather felt like guilt. Clara didn't stop writing, but the edge of her lip curled ever so slightly, as though she had overheard and understood more than they thought. And just like that, the waiting room became a mirror, and Henry saw himself for the first time, not as a man choosing love, but as one running from loneliness and landing in confusion. Time always seems to stall when truth stands in the room. The court clerk finally reappeared and motioned toward the trio, announcing that the judge was ready to resume. Henry rose like someone about to face music they didn't choose, while Olivia hesitated, her mind a carousel of second guesses. Clara closed her notebook, stood, and walked ahead of both of them, not looking back. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the documents again, flipping through the pages with fingers that had seen too many stories end at the stroke of a pen. But just as he was about to proceed, Clara lifted her hand, politely interrupting. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but undeniable, "I'd like to make a statement before we continue." The judge raised his brow, glanced at the file, then gestured for her to proceed. Clara stepped forward and turned slightly, not toward the bench, but toward Henry. Her eyes met his. "I loved you. Not perfectly, but fully. And even when you stopped loving me, I didn't hate you. I just began to love myself more." Olivia blinked rapidly as if something stung her eyes. Henry didn't move. Clara continued, "This divorce isn't about revenge or resentment. It's about release. You chose your path, and I have chosen mine. I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I refuse to carry what doesn't belong to me." She paused, then handed the judge a folded document. "I'm withdrawing from the divorce. I filed for a separation of assets, and I will live my life with peace as my only partner from now on." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge took a beat longer than necessary before nodding. "So noted," he said. And just like that, Clara sat back down, not lighter, but freer. Olivia couldn't hold it anymore. The air inside the courtroom now felt dense, like something sacred had been spoken and she didn't know how to sit beneath it. Her fingers trembled slightly, and when Henry reached out to touch her hand, she pulled away, not out of anger, but awakening. What she had fought so hard to have now looked different, like a crown that weighed too much. After the session ended, they stepped out again into the corridor. Clara didn't linger. She walked past them like a breeze that didn't know anyone comfort. Olivia turned to Henry, her voice barely audible. "She's not broken." Henry nodded slowly, pain flickering in his eyes like headlights through fog. "She was never broken. I just stopped seeing her." Olivia stepped back, arms folded, heart thumping. "And what exactly did you see in me?" The question floated, unanswered. She didn't wait for a reply. Instead, she pulled off her engagement ring and placed it gently in his palm. "I don't want to be a replacement. I want to be a choice. And clearly I wasn't." Then she turned, heels clicking down the corridor like punctuation marks at the end of a bad chapter. Henry stood alone, both women now moving away from him, one with grace, the other with awakening. He looked down at the ring in his hand, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. Outside, Clara's limousine waited again. She stepped in, closed the door softly, and for the first time in months, exhaled without pain. The driver pulled away slowly, and as the vehicle curved toward the exit, Clara didn't look back. Some stories aren't about what ends. They're about what finally begins. Clara's return home was not triumphant in the traditional sense. There were no champagne glasses clinking or girlfriends waiting to cheer her into a new chapter. The silence that met her at the door was familiar, but it no longer pressed on her chest like a weight. It greeted her like an old friend she'd finally made peace with. She kicked off her heels carefully, placed her handbag on the console table, and walked into the living room where sunlight poured in through half-open blinds, like a gentle audience applauding her composure. She took a moment to stand by the window, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and exhaled through her nose. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked like a woman enduring betrayal. It looked like someone who had crossed a wide river barefoot, bloodied but not broken. On the center table sat the bouquet of lilies she'd bought herself 2 days earlier, now fully bloomed, soft and fragrant. Clara reached out and adjusted one of the petals, smiling softly at how time and attention still had the power to draw life from stillness. The thought crossed her mind briefly, how Henry must have looked as she walked out, whether his shoulders slumped, whether his eyes followed the limo until it turned out of sight. But the thought passed like wind through dry curtains. She wasn't interested in mourning the parts of her that had already resurrected. The day wasn't about him. It was about the woman who once whispered maybe tomorrow to herself while folding laundry, and who now spoke in full stops and knew exactly when to walk away. Henry sat in his car long after Olivia had disappeared into the traffic, her cab turning a corner without hesitation, as though it had been waiting for the very moment she'd see clearly enough to leave. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, hands clenched at 10 and 2, the way a new driver holds on when learning the road. But Henry wasn't new to life. He was just realizing how unfamiliar it had become. He stared at the ring Olivia had placed in his palm earlier. The metal was still warm, her final touch lingering like perfume on a forgotten scarf. The symbol meant nothing now. Both women had left, and he had nothing to show for it but a fading bruise on his pride. His phone buzzed, calls, messages, a few emails, but he didn't answer. He couldn't bear the sound of another voice that didn't belong to either of them. The courtroom had stripped him bare in a way no gavel or decree ever could. Clara's words played in his mind on a loop, each one striking a chord that echoed into silence. I began to love myself more. That line hit harder than any accusation could have. It wasn't rage that unsettled him. It was the realization that she didn't need to scream to leave him shattered. Clara had exited not as a victim, but as a victor who no longer needed validation to know she'd won. Henry was used to fixing things, business deals, contracts, office disputes, but he now sat before the one thing he couldn't renegotiate: time. Time that had watched him drift from loyalty into fantasy, from appreciation into assumption. And now, like water through his hands, it was gone, and all he could do was sit in the wreckage of his own choices. Olivia packed in silence that evening. The apartment still smelled like cinnamon from the scented candles she'd burned the night before, trying to create warmth in a space that had always felt like a waiting room. Her suitcase thudded softly on the floor as she folded her clothes with mechanical grace. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't hurt, but because the pain had matured into something quieter, something that no longer needed tears to be acknowledged. She looked around at the photos she'd once been so proud to frame. Her and Henry at a beach resort, her leaning on his shoulder at a jazz lounge, both laughing at a private joke now lost in the ruins. One by one, she took them down. Not with fury, but with finality. She knew now that she had chased what looked like love, but felt like performance. Every compliment he gave was rehearsed. Every plan they made had Clara's shadow dancing behind it. Olivia realized she had stepped into a story that wasn't hers, and tried to rewrite the ending without understanding the characters. In the mirror, her reflection seemed older, not in years, but in clarity. She thought of the day she met Henry, the thrill of being chosen, the high of feeling wanted. But what good is being chosen when the man choosing you is only trying to escape his own emptiness? She zipped her bag slowly and walked to the door, pausing just once to look back. The apartment was spotless. too spotless. Like a stage waiting for the next scene. And she wasn't willing to be part of another act. As she pulled the door shut behind her, Olivia whispered to no one in particular, "Let someone else play pretend." Then she descended the stairs, not rushing, not dragging, just letting the steps carry her into whatever came next. The days that followed did not roar with drama. They unfolded like pages in a quiet book, each one gentler than the last. Clara resumed her morning walks, greeting neighbors with soft nods and collecting fresh bread from the local bakery, where the owner smiled at her with a knowing warmth. She took a pottery class, something she had once mentioned in passing, and tucked away behind excuses. Her hands, once used for stirring soup and ironing collars, now shaped clay into bowls and vases, every curve a reminder that broken pieces could still create something beautiful. In one of her sessions, she crafted a shallow basin and etched the words "still standing" beneath it. Not for anyone else to see, but for herself to remember. Meanwhile, Henry returned to an apartment that echoed. Without Olivia's laughter or Clara's quiet presence, the space became a museum of poor decisions and missed chances. He cooked for himself once, burned the rice, and left the kitchen without cleaning up. In the silence, he began replaying every moment, every delayed apology, every time he left Clara sitting alone with dinner for two. But there was no rewind button. Regret had no expiry date and is now stretched out before him like a cold, endless hallway. One evening, as he scrolled through his gallery and found a photo of Clara from years ago, laughing mid-sentence, her hand covering her mouth, he found himself weeping, not because she was gone, but because he never truly saw her when she was there. And while she drank tea on her balcony, watching the horizon with soft eyes, Henry sat in the dark, holding a picture that no longer smiled for him. Some lessons come like a storm. Others come in silence and settle where love once lived. A full month had passed since the courthouse silence turned into Clara's liberation, and the world had not paused to applaud her. There were no banners, no breaking news, just the rhythm of everyday life slipping back into its place, now with one less weight on her chest. The garden in her backyard had begun to blossom with marigolds, hibiscus, and soft lavender sprigs, flowers she once only admired in markets, but never had time to grow. Now, each bloom felt like a small applause from nature itself. Every morning, she watered them while humming under her breath, not for melody but for memory, and sometimes her fingers would hover above a bud just about to bloom, as though she recognized something familiar in its fight to open. Clara didn't write long journal entries anymore, just one-liners, reflections wrapped in truth like notes tucked beneath pillows. Peace isn't silent. It's just not loud. Forgiveness isn't permission, it's freedom with a gate. Each sentence was a step further into herself. One afternoon, she received a call from her younger cousin, Grace, who hadn't heard the full story but sensed something had changed. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in town. Clara wore jeans and a soft blouse, her hair tied in a low knot, her earrings small and golden. When Grace arrived and saw her seated with a half-empty teacup and a book resting on her lap, she paused, then smiled. "You look undone," she said, unsure if it was the right word. Clara chuckled, her laugh low like a song with bass. "Exactly," she replied. "Undone and just beginning." They sat for hours. Not once did she mention Henry, because some chapters are best left closed without bookmarks. Henry didn't bother shaving anymore. The stubble on his jaw grew wild, not out of rebellion, but because routine no longer had a reason to knock on his door. His apartment had grown quieter, colder, even though nothing had changed structurally. It was the energy, something unexplainable, like trying to warm your hands over a picture of a fire. He often sat by the window, not to look out, but because the seat by the glass used to be Olivia's favorite spot, and now it reminded him how even borrowed comfort can become memory's landmine. His friends reached out, some out of concern, others from curiosity, but he kept conversations short, letting their well-meaning advice float past him like leaves on a river he had no intention of navigating. He thought about calling Clara once, just to apologize again, to see how she was, to see if there was any room left in the house he had once taken for granted. But every time his thumb hovered over her contact, he remembered the look in her eyes that day in court, the way she said, "I forgive you," without offering an invitation. That kind of forgiveness felt like an unspoken farewell. One evening, he visited their old home. Not to speak, not to plead, but just to drive by. As he parked across the street, he saw her through the window, seated at a desk with a small lamp on, writing something. She didn't look sad. She didn't look angry. She looked full, complete. And that shook him more than anything, because Henry had always assumed he was the source of her joy. Now, watching her from the shadows, he realized he had only ever been a chapter in a much larger story, one that she had taken back into her hands with ink and certainty. Clara's life didn't become a fairy tale after the limousine or the courtroom, and she never expected it to. Bills still arrived, traffic still annoyed her, and rainy days still caught her without an umbrella sometimes. But what changed was how she carried herself through it all. She was no longer walking on eggshells trying to preserve a version of love that had long expired. She now walked with her shoulders back, not to appear strong, but because there was no longer anything trying to bend her inward. Her circle became smaller, tighter, filled with people who didn't need her to shrink to make space. She began attending poetry nights at the local library, not to share, but to listen. And each poem, no matter how abstract, touched something in her spirit that reminded her she wasn't alone. One night, a man approached her after the event, older, kind-eyed, with a smile that didn't ask for anything. He complimented the book she was reading, and they spoke for a few minutes before parting ways. She didn't entertain the idea of romance. Not yet. But as she walked back to her car, she realized her heart hadn't clenched at the thought. It didn't rush or panic. It simply accepted that new conversations were possible. That evening, as she soaked in her tub with candles flickering and soft music in the background, Clara whispered to herself, "You didn't lose him. You found you." And as her fingers trailed the water's surface, she let the tears come, not from sorrow, but from finally arriving at herself after years of being lost in someone else's idea of love. The final note of it all didn't arrive like thunder. It came on a Sunday morning when Clara stepped into her backyard with a cup of tea and noticed a bird's nest nestled in the crook of her garden wall. 2 small eggs sat inside, protected by twigs and soft leaves, and Clara smiled at how even fragile things knew how to build again. She sat on the bench, the sun warming her cheeks, and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Across town, Henry sat on the edge of his bed, holding a framed photograph of him and Clara from years ago, one she had left behind, intentionally or not. In the photo, her head rested on his shoulder, eyes closed, peace on her face. But now, as he stared at it, he realized the peace had never come from him. She had carried it all along. He had simply borrowed it. And like most things borrowed and mishandled, it was gone now. He placed the photo down, no longer trying to rewrite the past. He stood, dressed, and left for a walk, not to chase anything, but to finally learn how to be still. Back in her garden, Clara sipped her tea slowly, savoring the warmth as birds chirped softly in the distance. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Grace, "Thinking of you today. Proud of how far you've come." Clara replied with a single word, "Thankful." She closed her eyes, let the breeze kiss her cheeks, and for the first time in years, she didn't wonder what would happen next. She simply let the morning unfold, because some women don't rise like fireworks. They rise like dawn, quietly, steadily, beautifully, and the world never sees it coming until the sky is filled with light. And love, don't lose your voice trying to keep someone who has stopped listening. Sometimes, walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom wrapped in quiet courage. Let peace be your proof. Let healing speak louder than revenge. If someone fails to see your worth, Don't argue. Shine anyway. Because one day, they'll blink and realize the light they took for granted no longer waits in their doorway. May your heart never be a home for confusion. May the silence you carry bloom into strength. May every betrayal birth a better version of you. May the doors that closed on you be replaced by gates of new beginnings. May peace find you in still moments, and joy rise in you like morning light. May you love yourself enough to walk away when staying would cost you your soul. And may the future you walk into be softer, stronger, and so full of grace that all you can say is, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.